Hey everyone, welcome back to another crocheting video. I'm very excited because I'm finally sharing my process of crocheting flowers for the first time. So a few months back, one of my friends actually commissioned me to crochet some flowers for her, and not just any flowers, but she asked me to make the infamous Tangled Sundrop. I told her that I had never crocheted flowers before, but I also didn't want to let go of this opportunity, so I told her, you know what, let's go. I'm just going to do it. I've also always wanted to crochet some flowers, so this was just perfect for it. We started brainstorming, and there are many styles of crochet sundrops, but she told me she wanted hers to look like this. She also commissioned me to make some crochet lavenders and some decorative leaves to kind of frame the sundrop in a mini bouquet. I also added these sketches onto her inspo pic to help her envision everything a little better. So I needed to make the sundrop, 3 lavenders, and 2 sets of decorative leaves. But since I don't want to make this video too long, I will be making it into 2 parts. In this video, I'll only be showing my process of making the sundrop, while you can check out my process of making the lavenders and the decorative leaves in part 2. So for the sundrop, I needed to make the yellow base of the petals, the purple accent color that goes on top of each petal, the spirals that go in the center of the flower as its stamen, and finally, a leaf for the stem. Alright, now that everything was all planned out, let's finally start crocheting. We decided on this light yellow colored yarn and this kind of bright shade of purple for the petals of the sundrop. And I used a 3.5mm crochet hook for the entire flower. Now, I couldn't really freehand this since I'm pretty much clueless as to how it's made, so of course, what better way to learn than to follow some tutorials. But the thing is, I couldn't find any sundrop tutorial that produced the same type of sundrop as our inspo pic. So I thought since the sundrop looks similar to a lily, I looked through some crochet lily tutorials instead. And fortunately, I found this lily tutorial that looked pretty similar to the sundrop that we wanted to achieve, and I decided to follow that. I will of course link all the tutorials I followed in the description box below. For the first petal, I was still thoroughly following the tutorial and watching it in between making the flower and just, trying to get the hang of what to do. Towards the last round of the petal, it was time to incorporate some wire into them, which was one of the things that I also had to get used to, such as holding the wire in certain ways that's more convenient and won't get in the way as I crochet. I was also making sure that the wire was sitting nicely into the stitches. Finding the right size of wire was actually quite challenging as well. Since I don't have prior experience with using floral wires and was planning to buy them online, I had to look through different reviews and tutorials just to figure out the thickness of the wire I needed. It was quite confusing at first that I even had to buy the wires twice, but in the end, the wires I got still worked out pretty well. I definitely had to be careful working with the wires since the tips were pretty sharp and would poke me sometimes. When I finished my first petal, the second to the last round in the tutorial said to make a chain 3 at the tip, which gave me this hole that I wasn't really a fan of, so to close that off, I decided to redo that round, and instead of chaining 3 and skipping a stitch, I just put a single crochet in the stitch that we were supposed to skip. It turned out looking like this, which I liked a lot better. Also, adding the wire into the petal made a really big difference and gave the petal its shape instead of it looking all shriveled. My first petal looked like this. I'm really happy with it. I think the shape is great, and it looked like we were on the right track to finishing our sundrop. I just cut off the yarn and twisted the wires together like this to prevent them from moving around. The wires I used for the petals I think were a little too thin. Although they did keep the shape of the petal and everything, I will probably choose to use a slightly thicker wire if I were to make it again next time. But honestly, these were still good, and I just like to think that petals are meant to be delicate anyway. But yeah, I put a movie on, I locked in, and proceeded to crochet the rest of the yellow petals. I played Barbie and the Three Musketeers, which is a very nostalgic movie for me. I had always loved their montage of training and creating their final dresses with their transformations and everything. I was a big Barbie girl growing up, and the classic Barbie movies will always hold a special place in my heart. Anyways, I had the pattern of the petals written down to guide me while I continued crocheting, and the rest of the petals went by pretty quickly. I really was just enjoying my time as I crocheted with a movie playing in the background. After Barbie and the Three Musketeers, I watched Tangled. I don't know why I hadn't thought about it sooner, but what better movie to watch while making the Sundrop other than Tangled itself? It's also one of my favorite Disney movies, and I really had to stop myself from pausing every now and then just to watch the movie. Oh, and here's me going crazy during the lantern scene. I have watched it countless times, but I can never get over how beautiful it is. If not the most, it's probably hands down one of the most romantic Disney scenes there is. It just gets me every single time. The song, the animation, colors, everything just makes it so good. Alright, I think I've rambled a little too much over movies in the past couple of minutes, but I've finally finished all 6 of my yellow petals and they're all looking really good. Now that I've finished those, it's time to make the purple pieces that go on top of each petal. I had to freehand them because, again, I couldn't find a tutorial for this specific Sundrop, but I just used the yellow petal as my reference. The purple pieces are pretty much just shorter versions of the yellow petal, and here is the pattern that I came up with for this part. My first attempt was a bit too short for my liking, so I decided to redo it and made it a bit longer. Surprisingly, it only took me 2 tries until I got a size that I was pretty satisfied with. I didn't use any wires for the purple pieces since they were going on top of the yellow petals anyway. Once I've completed all 6 of my purple pieces, I used a darning needle and weaved the yarn tails into the back. Now here's what my pieces were looking like. There's no way I was going to sew the purple pieces onto the yellow petals, so of course I opted to glue them on instead. At first, I decided to use my E7000 fabric glue, but then the nozzle was so small and fine that there was very little glue coming out every time I squeezed the tube. It's great for gluing smaller things together, but it wasn't really helping me in my situation. I was struggling with the amount of glue I was getting, and the pieces weren't sticking as flat as I wanted them to be. So in the end, I just decided to take out my glue gun and use that to stick the petals together instead. Using a glue gun was surely the way to go because it made my work go by so much faster and easier. Although you also do have to work quickly once you've laid out the glue since they tend to dry up pretty fast too. You just have to be careful with the heat because your fingers could possibly get burned, which happened to me way too many times in the process of making this flower. And let me tell you guys, it hurt a lot. You definitely do not want that to happen to you too. If you're wondering what this pink thing is, it's actually my mini Bluetooth speaker, and I'm using it to press down on the purple pieces once I've glued them on to ensure that they are laying flat on the petal. I also did use more of the E7000 glue in the nooks and crannies that I thought needed more glue, since I'm just a perfectionist like that. Now that we have these, we can move on to the next step. These actually remind me more of peacock feathers instead of petals, but anyways, this time I'm going to work on the stamen of the flower. In this case, I needed 3 of them. The spiral in the middle was the longest out of the 3, so I cut the wires in different lengths. Before making the swirls, I wrapped the wire with the same yellow yarn I used for the petals. I was actually worried about this step since the wrapping might not turn out as well as I hoped. The tips of the wire where you start and end wrapping the yarn was my main concern, since I didn't want the tips to be so bulky with yarn and hardened glue. And naturally, I struggled quite a bit with my first try. I didn't really like how it turned out, so I tried it one more time, and fortunately, my second attempt looked much cleaner and neat. To create the actual spiral, I wrapped the wire around cylinders that I had, such as perfume bottles in various sizes, and worked my way from there. I used pliers to bend and curl the wire for a more precise curve at the center of the spiral until I was satisfied. I repeated this process 2 more times until I had all 3 of my spirals, and I think they turned out really pretty if I do say so myself. Next on the to-do list is the leaf of the Sundrop. I decided to use this moss green colored yarn and follow the same lily tutorial since that video also included how to make a leaf. We had to incorporate some wire again, and I think the wire I used was actually too thick since the leaf seemed too stiff for my liking. But either way, it still turned out pretty nice and didn't really make too much of a difference. Now that all the pieces of my Sundrop are complete, it's time for the scary part. I now have to assemble it all together to create a flower. For the stem, I will be using this thick size 12 wire. I first glued all the spirals onto the upper end of the bare wire. I had to make sure that these spirals were positioned properly and spread out nicely before gluing them down. Next, I had to figure out how to attach all the petals onto the stem. I planned to attach them one by one to create a more organic look to the flower. It looked so easy when I watched other people do it in YouTube tutorials, but for some reason, my petals just wouldn't stay put. I was struggling and fumbling with the petals, but nothing seemed to work. The wires I used were probably too thin that they couldn't hold the petals upright and kept falling outwards. It was stressing me out, and I was getting very frustrated until I decided that, you know what, I'm just going to follow the tutorial that I have been using this whole time. In the video, she connected 3 of the petals together at the bottom to create this sort of cone shape. I initially didn't use this method since I was worried that the finished flower would look less organic since, the petals were attached to each other. But then I tried it out, and honestly, it wasn't so bad, and I thought the flower still looked pretty good, so I decided to stick with this method. And plus points, it made the assembly so much easier now that I didn't need to worry about the individual petals falling out. Okay, so here you can see that I crocheted a few stitches of the petals together. If you can notice, this cone has its stitches on the outside, and this will be the inner set of petals. And if you notice this cone, its stitches are on the inside. This will then be the outer set of petals. I know it may sound confusing, but I suggest watching the tutorial that I followed for a more in-depth explanation. Now here comes a true challenge. With all that I had going on, with the wires and yarns from the petals and spirals, I struggled so much with attaching them to the stem. And also, as if everything wasn't already hard enough, I even got burned by the hot glue. I was busy trying to work fast to glue the wires onto the main stem that I didn't notice that the hot glue dripped onto my finger. And yeah, it was pretty bad. I took out the glue that got stuck to my finger and immediately ran my finger through running water to ease the pain. I still did get a blister afterwards though, but even though it hurt, I still had to keep working. I secured the inner set of petals first with yarn and a lot of glue and made sure they were nice and tight. As I was attaching the outer set of petals, some of the wires even poked my fresh blister, which wasn't very pleasant. I was really just keeping it together to not just break down and cry in front of this unfinished flower. No, I'm just kidding. We have to be strong. I wasn't really about to cry, but I definitely could have. Yeah. Anyways, I made sure to push the petals together so that there wouldn't be too big of a gap between them. I made my way down the stem, wrapping all the wire and yarn tails with the same green yarn I used for the leaf, making sure that everything was nice and tight. I had to make sure that the yarn was wrapping around evenly and that none of the wires or yarn tails were showing through. I also added a bit of glue every now and then to make sure that the yarn wouldn't budge. When I got to the middle portion of the stem, I then added the leaf. Honestly, deep inside my head, I was so frustrated with how much I was struggling with wrapping the wire with yarn. There were so many elements going on at the top which made the flower pretty heavy, and then I had to add a leaf, and then the stem itself was pretty long, so I had to move around it just so that the yarn wouldn't get all tangled. And I also had to make sure I wouldn't touch the hot glue, and I was also constantly checking on my blister since it was stinging really bad. I don't know, everything altogether just made this so much more stressful than I thought, and this was my first time doing this too. I'm surprised my patience got me through the whole thing, to be honest, and I was just so happy when I finally got to the end of the stem. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but honestly, I think it was decent enough, and I think I did a pretty good job. Now that the stem was fully wrapped and all the elements of the flower were secured, it's time for the exciting part. I carefully curled out the petals as well as the leaf, and now I finally get to see the Sundrop in full bloom. If you ask me, this was definitely a very fulfilling experience after all that I've been through. I'm really proud with how my Sundrop turned out, and I think it looks really pretty. All the hard work was definitely worth it for this. Now, if you want to see the rest of my experience with crocheting florals for the first time, you can go ahead and check out part 2 where I crochet lavenders and decorative leaves to complete my friend's commission. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in my next one. Bye guys!